another pro photographer's reaction today. This time we're looking at the car creative. His name is Alex, a YouTuber from Canada, primarily doing car photography and videography. This video of his is him editing someone else's photo using Lightroom. So we're going to take a look at that. But before we get started, I just wanted to lay some ground rules and foundations on my opinion towards his video, because otherwise it just becomes my opinion versus his opinion, and there's not much value there because it's a free country and everyone can do whatever they want. So I'm going to come from the perspective of a commercial photographer's angle. I've been doing car photography for over 20 years. I've shot for brands like Tesla, Ferrari, Lamborghini, and I think I know what it takes to satisfy those types of clients. And I'm just going to use my knowledge and experience to judge what Alex is doing to this fellow's photo. So without further ado, let's go.
Today, we are going to be taking this raw, beautiful photo and turning it into this beautiful photo.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty big change. This is going to be interesting.
Let's dive into this. We won't be using any presets. We're going to go from start to finish, and I'll try and break down as much of my process as possible.
I wonder if he's only using Lightroom to retouch his images. Does he use Photoshop at all, or does he use Capture One at all? I mean, Capture One optional, but Photoshop probably necessary. I don't know if he's just trying to make this video to cater to someone who's only using Lightroom. It's possible, but ultimately I think Photoshop gives you way more control, even though it's probably a steeper learning curve.
So let's start up at the top there in the settings. Got a shutter speed of 1/1600. His aperture is f2.2 and his ISO is at 100. So something you can see here is that he's actually using a 35mm lens with the ability to do 1.4 and chooses not to, which I respect, because typically when you close down your shutter a little bit, you get a slightly sharper image. So,
okay, 1600 of a second is a bit weird. It's a bit high. I never really go that high. I don't know why here, but I think it's because he's shooting pretty wide open outdoors in daylight. So ISO 100 is fine. F2.2 is a bit weird. I'm not sure what's going on here. It's a 35mm lens. That's not gonna, by nature, give you that much shallow depth of field, even if you shoot wide open. So I think he's probably trying to get that super blurry background look, but as a 35mm is not gonna give you that even at wide open. So there's no point trying. I don't know if it's the background that he doesn't like and he's trying to blur it to oblivion to just try to hide all the mess. But generally, when I shoot cars, I'm shooting at 5.6, f8, f11, around that range, just to make sure the car is pretty sharp. And if you choose a really nice environment and background, you know, keep those sharp. I mean, there's no point blurring them to oblivion. And so 1600ths of a second shutter speed, I think it's because he's compensating for the fact that he's shooting pretty wide open. But I think there's a lot more to that because the image looks underexposed. But we'll get to that in a second.
And if you look, as the first thing that I always do is I adjust my crop. You can see he's even putting the car on the rule of thirds with the Sunoco logo there also on a rule of thirds. So it's actually a really beautifully composed photo, and it will sit really nicely on Instagram as well.
Okay, screw Instagram. Who cares about Instagram? Like, if you're shooting for Instagram, I think you're pretty much a content creator, which I guess is not a bad thing. But as a photographer, you know, don't compromise your cropping and your framing just so that it fits the Instagram grid, because, like, you know, there's a lot more creative freedom you can do. In terms of framing this shot, I question it. I mean, Alex seems to think it's beautifully done. I have some issues here because I'm not sure what's going on. Forget the exposure, that's another thing. But just looking at the framing itself, there's a lot of sky in the shot. I don't know why there's that much sky. Rule of thirds is kind of BS. I don't believe in it. I don't think you should either, because it's not a rule. I don't want people thinking that you have to frame your shot using rule of thirds. For my stuff, I do end up having some shots framed using rule of thirds, but it wasn't something that I kept in my mind as I was framing. It just happened to be a coincidence by the time I finished with the image. So yeah, sure. Once in a while, I'll have an image that ends up being rule of thirds, but otherwise I just try to be a bit more open to creative freedom and see what's what. And I can shoot something perfectly symmetry. I love doing that, but it's not going to be like, oh, I have to keep to the rule of thirds because, there's no reason to. No one says you have to. So in this case, yes, someone stuck to the rule of thirds, ended up with a lot of sky, a lot of very bright sky in the background. And that's compromising his exposure because he's trying to keep the highlights down and ending up darkening the car way too much when the car is the main subject of the shot. So he's exposing for the wrong thing. He's exposing for the sky to keep the sky from blowing out. But in turn, the car went too dark. And when you go too dark on exposure, yes, the cameras nowadays are great and you can recover a lot of shadows, but you're starting with a compromise, a big one. And retouching will help only so much in the end. So I question that. Why do you need that much sky? Can you just crop out the sky? Like, it doesn't need to be there. Same goes for the Sunoco sign. Is there some relationship between the Sunoco sign and the car? Is there some sponsorship deal going on? I doubt it. So why is the sign there? You got to ask yourself these questions because every little element in your shot is important.
All right, so from here, I'm actually going to make sure to click on and make sure chromatic aberration and profile correction is on. You can see that you get a little bit extra vignetting if you have that on. So we're just going to do that to take away vignetting. That's in the lens corrections tab here.
Chromatic aberration, yeah, I agree that you should click that button and get rid of it. I almost always do that. But with the lens profiles, be careful, okay? From what I understand, Adobe doesn't really make accurate lens profiles. Capture One does, because I know Capture One, they actually take a lens and then they analyze a physical lens. I'm not sure if Adobe does that for Lightroom. So these profiles, when you apply them, be careful because they might overcorrect or undercorrect, or they may not get rid of all the vignetting. Just use it wisely and don't just, click it and forget it.
I look and assess this photo. It's very flat. Obviously, the sun isn't popping. There's not a lot of directional sunlight. It's a flat day. So I'm actually going to try and warm this photo up and bring in some extra dynamics.
Okay, it's not really a flat day. It's not an overcast day. You can see that there actually is a sun back there somewhere. It's just hidden behind the stadium. It's a bit different quality of light. A flat day would be very low contrast and drabby. But here you can see there is some contrast in the sky and it's reflecting off the car. So it's not completely overcast.
To start, I'm going to bring up my exposure to make sure the car is looking good. We're going to bring down the highlights. And I'm always looking up in this top left corner to make sure that I'm keeping everything exposed properly. So I might even bring that down a little bit to make sure we've still got the sky.
Yeah, you see? First thing, he's trying to save the sky. And I'm just questioning, again, why is the sky so important? It doesn't need to be there. It's taking up a whole third of the image. And I'm just thinking, if you're going to shoot the car and it's a car shot, maybe crop in tighter, or just pick another area. So I really have this issue with the sky.
And when it comes to automotive photography and bringing my shadows up, I'm always looking in the deep, dark areas like here, and specifically around the wheels, because we want to make sure to bring out the details in the dark areas.
Okay, that's true. When I'm trying to adjust my shadows, I look at stuff like the tires of the car, because that is the perfect representation of something that's dark, black, but also with detail. Because if you look at really deep blacks, like inside the wheel well, first of all, that stuff isn't important. And secondly, you can't see detail. So you need something that's dark and it's pretty much black. I won't use tires to white balance on though, because they're not perfectly black in color. But in terms of tones, they're a good example to use to judge your darkest shadows with detail.
That's blowing out details in the white. So I want to make sure to retain all the details there and maybe even drag those down to make sure we're getting all the details in the sky.
Okay, so I think I know what he's doing. He's trying to balance out the tonal range of the image because it came out from the camera really contrasty, underexposed, and he's just trying to even everything out, keep the highlights in check, keep the shadows in check. It looks really flat right now, but I think he's going to probably do more to it. Not sure if that's the best way to go. What I usually do is I try to shoot it the way that I want it to come out in the end. So in the shooting stage, I've said this many times, is to try to get as much done in the camera so that it doesn't end up looking like something completely different when you finish with editing.
So now I'm going to go into the tone curve, and I'm going to actually see if we can save the sky a little bit and bring some of the softness back into the photo. And then when it comes to the midtones of the curve, I usually like to pop these up because that tends to be where the car sits in the frame. Here, we're just popping that up to make sure that the car is going to be exposed properly. And then on the bottom third, we're going to bring this back down just to taste to make sure that we have a good enough contrast in there as well. And I'm not actually loving how it kind of makes the blacks look a little mushy there. So I might adjust some of these a little bit to make sure it looks a little better, because we can use masks, which we're going to get into later, to make sure that car pops and stands out. Maybe we can add a touch of a fade here by dragging that bottom button up. And you could even push that to the right and it does some fun fadey things too.
Okay, so I see what he's doing. He's doing global adjustments first before he starts masking. I think he's going to do masking later on, which is the right way to do it. You want to start making adjustments that affect the entire image. And then once that is pretty well set, then you can start masking and adjust independently different elements, different objects in the shot. So, but you can't do that until the overall image looks pretty decent.
A big thing for me in automotive is oftentimes I look at the ground and it tends to be gross colors in the cement. So I'm actually going to do my best to take out some of these gross colors. So if we come down to our color mixer, part of what I'm going to start doing is it tends to be in the yellows is where there's a lot of nasty colors, and sometimes in the oranges as well. So we can see, yeah, it's a lot of the oranges are down in the cement area there.
Okay, if he's fixing the color of the ground, I would probably mask that out first, because what he's doing now is affecting the entire image. So when he's desaturating some of the yellows from the concrete, which does happen, he's affecting all the other yellows in the shot as well, which is probably not something you want to do. You might want to keep those unaffected. So in this case, I would just mask out the ground first and then desaturate the colors that you want.
Aquas tend to land in windshields. Yep, you can see here. If I drag that down, it's going to land in the windshields, but it's not even affecting the color of the car a whole bunch. And then we have a lot of blues happening, so I'm just going to drag those down a little bit as well.
Aquas tend to land in windshields, yes, and also greens, because when you look at the glass and you analyze it, there's a lot of green tint in the glass for some good reason, I must assume. But the question is, do you want to remove that color? It's meant to be there. I usually leave it in unless there's a client request that they just want the glass to look as clean and as neutral as possible. Same goes for the aquas, which is basically reflections of the sky, blues. I usually keep those in because it just adds realism to the shot. If you take it away, you're making it look pretty fake. And there's nothing wrong with adding a bit of color to the glass. Like, who said that?
What I want to show you is in the color grading. This part is where I bring a lot of my personal style into editing in the color grading. Because even if you really desaturate an image, in color grading, you can bring your style or your favorite colors into it. So this is where I do 220 in my shadows with a saturation of 10. And this is only affecting the dark parts of the image. Then when you go to your midtones, this little nubbin here is the midtones. I actually don't do any colors in the midtones. I just bump the luminance a little bit. And then in the highlights, I go 35 in the hue with a saturation of 10. And that's just to get me started.
Okay, I don't normally do this. This is him just kind of making it's kind of a preset, because he did mention that this is something he always does that adds style to his image. I'm not sure what's going on here. He's making a slight color adjustment to the shadows and to the highlights. And I think that each image deserves its own color grade. If you are serious about photography and the image that you took, you should not kind of apply a preset, so to speak. And this goes for LUTs as well. LUTs are crap. Like, don't use them. But in this case, it's the same thing, because it seems like he's always doing this to the same every image that he goes through. And I'm not sure if that's required. Again, no one says that you have to kind of establish some sort of base numerical value for your shadows and numerical value for your highlights. Just take it as it goes. Each image is different.
This looks really good because we're sharpening the car, the Sunoco logo, and the stadium around it. But we're taking away the sharpening on, say, the side of the car and the panels, which we don't really want to add noise in that area.
Okay, sharpening. Quick tip here. There's usually 3 stages of sharpening, okay? He's talking about one of them. But usually what happens when you capture an image straight from the camera, you apply a little bit of sharpening just to correct for any slight blurriness from the capturing stage. Nowadays, you don't have to do a lot. Like, it's very minimal, if at all, because the cameras are so good now. The second stage in sharpening is what he's talking about here, which is the sharpening that you do in retouching. And you can't go overboard here. You just do just enough, maybe just enough, and then back off a little bit. The third stage of sharpening is to sharpen for the output. Depends where your image is going. If it's going to Instagram, you might not need to sharpen it at all, because most of the time you're taking a high-res image and you're compressing it down to a low-res image for Instagram. And during that compression stage, things sharpen up by themselves naturally. But if you're going the other way, if you're blowing up to something big like a billboard or a print ad or something like that, you might need to add a bit more sharpening at the very end just to optimize it for that particular output, whether it's a print or digital.
People have different opinions on when to denoise in the process. I haven't found that it affects it overly much where you do it in the process.
I usually denoise in the early stages just to set the base of where I'm going afterwards. But I usually work with retouchers, so they have the ultimate call when to apply denoise. But it's not usually something I would leave to the very end, let's put it that way. It happens a bit earlier in the stage.
If you wanted to do a more stylized edit, you can add some grain. I'm starting to enjoy adding subtle bits of grain to take away the digital look of photos.
Yeah, adding grain does help a little bit, but if you're doing it to take away the digitalness of the image, it's done at such a small amount and such a high magnification that most people won't even notice it. So you're basically doing it for yourself, just to satisfy yourself that you're taking a digital image and you're making it a little bit more granular by adding grain. Only you can see it, because no one else will.
Masking is the most critical part of any photo. If you are just getting this far, then you are only using half of what Lightroom has available to you. So first and foremost, I want to actually warm this photo up. So we're going to go up to our temperature dial and we're going to warm it up a little bit, because I want this to look more like sunset kind of vibes.
Okay, not sure where this is going. I sense something interesting about to happen.
I use linear gradients a ton. So we're just going to hit M and we're just going to drag it up towards the middle of the car. You can move it left, right, and you can see how it's going to adjust that. But if you hold shift, it'll give you a perfectly straight line.
Okay, darkening the foreground. That's a common thing. We all do it. The way he's doing it though, I would probably paint it in, because painting it makes it look a bit more organic. Right now he's using a linear gradient, which is basically a line. Even though that line is blurred as a gradient, but it's still a line. And that may look a little bit fake, depending on how strong he applies that darkening. But I would just paint it in, it's just easier.
So now when I'm doing a car mask, one thing I love to do is actually use the curve tool instead of the exposure. There's nothing wrong with using the exposure and adding contrast and those kinds of things. But I find that if I use the curves tool, I can bring and add highlights in and midtones, and then use the balance on the bottom half of the curve to make it sit really naturally as well.
In terms of tonal adjustments, I think that the way you go from least amount of control to the most amount of control is levels. That's the least amount. Curves is second. You get more control. And the third one is, in this case, in Lightroom, I would suggest trying out luminance masking, which basically isolates the highlights from the midtones, from the shadows, and you can adjust each one independently. The problem with that is it's an advanced tool, because if you go overboard, for example, the shadows may not blend into the midtones that well. You might see some artifacts if you go too crazy with one of those two adjustments. Same goes for the midtones to highlights. So the transition between midtones, highlights, shadows, you need to pay attention to that. If you are being too aggressive, you'll see it.
Because it looks like we have light coming up here, I'm actually going to add a cheeky pop of light that looks like it's coming through this window, I guess. So we're going to add exposure, make it look like the sun's popping through there. We're going to add a bunch of warmth to make it look like the sun. And then we're going to go down to the dehaze, and we're going to drag that to the left to make it look a little bit more misty, so to speak. And then if we go into saturation, let's do that to make it pop. That looks like the sun's trying to pop through.
That is crap. Yeah, sorry to say, but sorry, Alex. No good. Like, again, I'm coming from the commercial photographer's perspective, right? We don't do this. We probably did it earlier on in the career. At some point along the way, we learned the hard lesson that this is just cannot be done. You cannot change the weather. You cannot change the lighting when you're shooting outdoors under natural light. You know, Photoshop is powerful, but it cannot change this. What he's doing now is adding a light source, the sun. But when you do that, oh, I'm going to add a light. Well, you can see the light source, and that's the easy part. What most people don't realize is that that light that you're adding is also lighting things in the shot. How are you going to correct for that? How are you going to show the back of the car lit up by that sun that you just added? How are you going to show the shadow that it creates, the hard shadow on the ground from that light you just created? It can't be done. And, you know, that sun that you add could be lighting the Sunoco sign. It could be lighting the entire stadium. You know, how are you going to light that up in Photoshop? You can't.
And I want to actually pull up the saturation so we can bring back that, what is this usually called? Like green metallic jade or something like that. So we're going to try and pull that out.
Yeah, so this is really important to get the car color correct, because when you're shooting commercially, this is like, people need to know what car they're buying and all the colors available. So if you don't get it right now, it's going to be an issue.
It's a pretty cool image. If I look up in the top left corner, my eye is drawn to the car first. We've gone from a pretty flat looking image here to a pretty warm image where the car is really popping out.
Okay, I think Alex did a pretty decent job overall, except for adding that sun at the very end. The main problem I have with this whole overall process is that the image that started wasn't shot in the most ideal way, I would say. Again, the sky was a problem. It didn't need to be there. And there was so much work done to save it when the car was actually the focal point. I think just when you're at the shooting stage, just pick another angle or another vantage point, just frame the car better. That usually solves 99% of the problems is at the shooting stage. So exposure was under, that was saved thanks to modern technology and, decent retouching from Alex's part. But the sun in the end, gosh, like that's just horrendous. Like, can't do that. You can probably do that, like I said earlier, when you're just shooting for fun and you don't care about what anyone says. But from a commercial perspective, if you want a sun, you better make sure that the real sun is in your shot, not some fakery that you add in Photoshop later. It's just never going to work. I've talked to so many people, clients, pro retouchers. They all agree that you cannot change the lighting. You cannot change the weather. If you want to shoot in different weather, you shoot on a different day. But that's pretty much any rule that I would stand by, even though I just told you that the rule of thirds is garbage. But if there is one rule, this is the one. You cannot fake lighting or weather. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you again next time. If you don't know, I also run consultations and mentorship programs. Hit me up in the email in the description below. Thanks again.